Welcome back, everybody. Happy New Year. I hope you guys had some great holidays and you had a little bit of a rest. But we are back. We're back here today with my kind of half-yearly stats show, let's say. Wartally has done their latest meta report, so I've compiled all of that information. I've filtered out all of the stuff that's basically irrelevant to anything. So today we're going to be looking at faction win rates, we're going to be looking at popular allies, we're going to be seeing at what people are looking at, what people aren't looking at, and we're going to try and make sense of the meta that we ended up in at the end of last year. So a bit of a caveat into the numbers here. What I did is I took every single game that happened throughout the last 6 months. I chose to do it since the April update because that represents the last very big addition to the game. There are some factions that I decided not to include or just to include the last 3 months worth of data. The reason for that is that we got battle traits, and for some factions specifically, they represent a pretty big update to their faction, how they play, and so I didn't want that data getting muddled. The other couple of factions that I've thrown in there are things like Skaven, who got a lot of really big updates in the last September FAQ, and Nighthaunt, whose battle trait in combination with the April updates basically make them a completely different warband than they used to be. All right, so look at the win rates themselves. What you see, Skaven doing very, very well at the moment. They are sitting on something like a 65% win rate almost. Maggotkin of Nurgle Demons are still riding high despite the hits that they took. That kind of just shows you that Plague Bearers are still doing very, very well, even at their new price point. Hedonites of Slaanesh Cyberites, they've seen a big resurgence in popularity recently, and I think that's because you can make the Slaanesh good stuff list, where you are going to be using Slake Slash. You've got the very cheap Blissbrew Homunculus to build out the numbers. You've got toughness in there. You've got speed in there. You can ally in Vexmore. You can do a lot with Slaanesh Cyberites, and it's showing. Kharadron Overlords, again, despite the hits that happened in the middle of the year, and let's remember that this data is coming from all events from then, they are still doing very, very well. Now, I said this at the time, that they are basically not all Aether Cannons or Fight for Profit. They still have a lot of very efficient fighters. Even their basic guys, very efficient for what they do. They can sit on one point, they can shoot people at another point. Their Skypikes, I've been saying this for the longest time, have some very good damage numbers for the amount of points that you're paying. The characters are still solid, the abilities are still solid, and this really shows that they're still sitting above a 55% win rate. The other faction that I think we need to think about is Ogre Maw Tribes. We know Gutlords are good, okay? People have been bringing 1, 2 Gutlords, a bunch of Crushers, a bunch of normal Ogres, supplementing them with a lot of Noblars. Ogre Kingdoms can regularly put on the field 8, maybe even 9-man lists if they really wanted to, and that combination of really big, really chunky guys, along with just a lot of numbers, is doing very well for them. Are Gutlords a problem? Most probably, I think. They've got that 5-10 damage profile. You can bless them up to make them 4 attacks. They basically touch something and they die. They've got Might Makes Right, which allows them to make another move or attack action after they kill a thing. They got on the Maw Path that allows them to move really quickly because they get that boosted move. I think that might be next on the sights of Games Workshop's balance department, probably along with something out of Skaven, maybe even Maggotkin of Nurgle Demons, but how much of that is down to the allies that they're taking as opposed to the basic faction, that's something that we have to take a look at. Going down to the bottom of the pack, Untamed Beasts. I'm sorry, Toast, you've been playing a lot of Untamed Beasts. They have not been doing all that well in events. And let's bear in mind that to get on here, they have to have a certain amount of games. I think it's 32 games over that period. They've got that. They're not doing well. Maybe it's down to the fact that a lot of the players like to play Untamed Beasts just as a one-box warband. They're very much casual players. You know, pick up whatever you've got, go to the event, have a good time. That's a possibility, but that's something I think that we need to look deeper into the numbers for. Also at the bottom, Questor Soulsworn is very surprising. I see Questor Soulsworn down here. I think that might be down to the proliferation of things like Ogre Kingdoms, of things like Vexmore, any of these big smashy fighters that a lot of people like to take nowadays. The meta is very much smaller lists, but way more damaging. Those smaller, more elite lists might be struggling into this kind of meta, and it kind of shows. I don't think that means that Quest or Soulsworn necessarily need a buff in themselves. I think that there are other problems on the top end that might need to be addressed. Some other things that are interesting down here, you've got Wildercorp's Hunters. Despite the fact that Wildercorp can put forward the best list in the format, as far as I'm concerned, they're not doing that well. So what does this tell me? It's really saying that people aren't super tailoring their Wildercorp lists. They are maybe bringing only what's in the box, maybe only converting a couple of Trailblazers. And when you do that, they are far more fair as a team. Because they're very close to 45% win rate, I'm not especially worried about them. But that's an interesting observation that you can make just based on the win rates alone. Okay, everybody, we did it. We absolutely smashed it last year. We hit that 3,000 subscriber goal. Then let's do it again this year. We're going for 5K. All you need to do is like and subscribe. And in fact, no, you don't need to subscribe. What I would like you to do now, after you finish watching this video, I've got a massive playlist of all sorts of things Warcry. Check out one of those videos and see if that's what you like. But if you want to throw some more support my way, you can join me here as a member. You can join me over on Patreon. You can join my Discord. Links for that are going to be down in the description below. Either way, you get to see stuff before it's released. You get to have a say into the kind of content that I create in the future. That's it from me for now. Let's get back to the video. There are a couple of things that I want to take a look at. I wanted to look at how old Ironjawz are doing versus new Ironjawz. Interesting thing is that since September, they had more than enough games to be able to make it into this report, just as many as the old Ironjawz players. It seems like a lot of the old Ironjawz players really love that team and they are sticking through. There was a lot of talk at the time like, oh, Ironjawz have got nerfed because of the increase in points of our boys, but it looks like the changes to their playstyle along with their new battle trait are still pretty effective. I do think that's something that will slowly creep up as people get more and more comfortable with the new Ironjawz playstyle. Another thing I'd like to look at, old Skaven versus new Skaven. New Skaven are on 64.8%. The chatter on Discord and the chatter on Reddit is that it's all down to the Rat Ogres. I would agree. I think the new Rat Ogres are very, very good. I think they double, that gives them extra actions, but the caveat of doubling the damage to them is very, very strong. But I'm not super worried about the new Rat Ogres. Yes, they're very good. Yes, they're expensive. Between you and me, I think this is mostly a skill issue. In this meta, where people are bringing smaller warbands, but more punchy, Rat Ogres, when you combine them with Packmasters to give the extra attacks and the extra activations, again, on top of what they already have, that just happens to be the best thing. Does this mean that it's some kind of unsurmountable problem? No, I don't think so. I just think that people are trying to push their 200-point fighters into almost 300 points worth of combo and expecting things to come out evens. You kind of can't play like that. Skaven, yes, they also have the access to their battle trait, which allows them to resurrect things. So between the two, you've got the Rat Ogres and the Resurrect. You just have to play a different kind of play style. You have to play more control-y for the Rat Ogres. Maybe we're talking about bringing more nets, things like the True Blood. Get that auto net in there. That just shuts down a Rat Ogre completely. It shuts down the entire Rat Ogre Packmaster combo. Yeah, when it hits you, you'll die from it, but there are other ways to take it down. Alternatively, Kharadron Overlords have been doing pretty well. So what that tells me is what they have going for them into that Skaven matchup is that they can do damage at range. And once they start to do that, as soon as you put 14 wounds onto a Rat Ogre, it stops it from using its own ability because it will basically fall down dead if it wants that extra attack action. So I think that's where we're going to go. I think we're going to go down more control routes, damage at range, and a whole bunch of abilities and a whole bunch of just basic shooting attacks that can do that into Rat Ogres. And I think as time progresses, we're going to see that win rate come down to something more manageable. Slaves to Darkness also had their hits to Marauders earlier on. A lot of people said that that was the end of Slaves to Darkness and that's all that you would see. A lot of people have jumped off of that bandwagon. The number of games is almost halved. Still enough to get onto this, which is interesting, because if you're sitting on a 50% win rate, you're absolutely fine. A lot of people have adapted their lists. They've gone into the Vexmore route as opposed to the former Crusher route that they would have taken previously. You can still bring Marauders. Marauders are still very good. It's just they're fair now. And that's reflected in their numbers. I think they're still a fine faction. I still think there's a lot going on for them. So they're doing okay. One thing I do want to say is that Hordes of Hashut, they got hit first to their Shatterers. They got hit secondly to the Flamethrowers. I think those were fair hits. I think Shatterers were too good, and I think Flamethrowers were too good. You can still run double Flamethrowers if you really want to. You just have to run a much smaller warband, but people have totally jumped off that. We used to have Hordes of Hashut being represented in competitive play. Since September, absolutely nothing. So I think that's a bit sad. I think that a lot of those Horns players could just come back and look again to see what they were doing. You can still put respectable Hordes of Hashut lists on the field. After the first hits to Shatterers and the Fulminate Crusher, people just stopped bringing that, and they started bringing Vex more, and they were basically bringing the same lists. That's kind of not the point of a balance hit. The idea is that it should restrict what you're bringing, so they went further in September. I still think it can be really good. I just think people need to play them. I said this at the beginning, but to get on here, you need to get at least 32 games throughout that period. There were a number of warbands that didn't manage to do that. That's why I stripped them out. Otherwise, you get really weird things like, oh, me going 4-0 with Tarantulas Brood gives 100% win rate. So this is for everybody. This is for all the warbands that were played, regardless of how many games. You can check that out now. You can check out where your favorite warband sits on this list and how it's doing. Just bear in mind that there might not be enough games in there to give meaningful results. An interesting statistic is that pretty much all of the warbands got representation here, apart from, I think, Demons of Khorne, so I'm really sorry, Demons of Khorne. But yeah, every warband has been played in some kind of way, so you guys can check that out, see where your favorite warband sits. In terms of representation, what was the most popular thing? Well, by and large, it was still Soulblight Gravelords. Despite the hits in April, and despite the further hits to Soulblight Gravelords in September, people still love to play them. So Soulblight, regardless what you guys said about, oh, Soulblight is dead, they got hit too hard, all of their cheap stuff is gone, you're still doing well, everything still seems to be okay. I would say the Soulblight are fixed. They're putting warbands on the table that can win games, and they don't need that excess of excessively cheap chaff to be able to do it for them. Some other things, we've got Cruel Boys seem to be extremely popular, 5%. Seraphon, kind of expected. I expected them to be very popular, especially after the Croxagores got added back in April, and they seem to be doing pretty well, right? Sitting on a 51% win rate. That's really good for them. I'm happy that they're doing that. Not many podium hits, though. So it shows that despite the wins of Seraphon, they are not really getting up there to top 1, 2, or 3. So maybe that's something that the Seraphon players have to take a look at. Or maybe it's just an indication that Seraphon are in a good place, and maybe there are other gatekeepers in competitive play that are stopping them from getting up there. Finally, I want to talk about Vulcan Flameseekers, 44.7% win rate. So they've dropped down a little bit. Toast has talked about this before, how Vulcan Flameseekers aren't really doing all that well into this meta. They're kind of doing okay, just under a 45% win rate, so still not, I don't think, anything that should be worried about. But 6.57% of all games played. That is the second highest after Soulblight Gravelords. That means that they still are very popular, one of the more popular warbands, and maybe it's just down to the fact that a lot of people are playing them that it pulls down that win rate. All right, we've looked at the global win rate, so now let's take a look at podium data. Here is the information for everybody. You've got the amount of times they came 301 or better, podium placings if they came first, second, or third, and you've got the amount of times those factions managed to get first place. Some of these things up here aren't all that much of a surprise. We've got Hedonites of Slaanesh Cyberites who managed to go 3-1 6 times, get top 3 5 times, and then of those top 3 managed to get the top spot 4th. So that really backs up that 65% win rate that we were looking at before. But then we've got other figures here that are slightly more interesting and give a slightly different story than the global win rates would suggest. So if we take Ironjawz, for example, they were sitting on a global win rate of 49%, but here we can see that they managed to podium 7 times and take the gold in 5 out of those 7, with 9 times doing 3 or more. So what this is kind of telling me is that there is a large cohort of Ironjawz players who really do like to play the faction, but at the upper power levels of the game, at the upper level of the game, Ironjawz seems to do extremely well. This kind of goes back to what me and Toast were talking about actually when we were looking at the changes from September, where we think that Ironjawz might be one of those warbands that gatekeep the top of the meta. They do have all of that tech like Humessin, the shield push, and all of those additional pieces, the inherent toughness, the inherent amount of wounds, that makes them so formidable. Similarly, with Soulblight Gravelords, they are looking at a 49.5% win rate, which is perfectly reasonable on a global scale. If we look at their podium placings, they managed to hit first, second, or third more times than any other warband in the game, and then half of those were golds. So pretty much like Ironjawz, it seems to tell me that there are a lot of Soulblight Gravelord players, but once you do manage to practice and get really good with the faction, you'll be able to podium far more easily. And I think that's what we are looking at here. If you look at the different warbands on the top, that manage to do 3-1 or better, we're really looking at those warbands that have consistency. Things like Ironjawz, Soulblight Gravelords, Cyberites now have been doing very well. Slaves to Darkness, because they've been able to take Vex more and just generic good stuff. All of these warbands have the potential to do very well in events, to top events, and they are more consistent than those warbands that we might see at the bottom here with maybe only 1 or 2, 3 or better placings, and of those, not many might be podium. That being said, if you do look at the bottom of this, I think that's really where individual player skill expression might come in. Any of these warbands that aren't topping regularly, but have managed to get podium placings or golds, I think that might be more a testament of the skill of the player and the ability of the player than those warbands having that raw efficiency and the consistency that you might otherwise see out of the top of the list. Let's take a look at the allies that people like to take. This is per Grand Alliance, and this is their popularity in the percentage of warbands that ally showed up in. So starting with Order, Eric Questor with Grandhammer shows up in 12% of all Order warbands. Cyrene of the Abyss from Identithipian, 9%. That's really interesting. Cyrene is actually a very good control piece. She's got a lot going for her. She's got that very interesting ability that allows her to draw a line to a corner of the battlefield and then do a little bit of damage, but then stop all sorts of movement abilities. So I think it's good that we're seeing Cyrene. Calthea Zandai is sitting there, 8% of warband popularity. People ask these questions and they say, oh, Calthea is everywhere. Everyone just brings Calthea. There's no reason not to bring her. That's really not the case. If she's only turning up in 8% of Order warbands as an ally, it kind of shows you that people are doing other things with their allies. The Eric Questor Grandhammer shows up way more, and that's kind of obvious. It still has that movement ability. It's a lot cheaper than Calthea is, and it can do damage. So I think Calthea is fine. I think she's in a fine spot. There are still people who call for her to be nerfed or her to be hit, but I think she's okay. She doesn't even turn up more than 10% of the time. Going into Death, the Kavalos Centauri, 20%. Well, that's just like one guy who really wanted to play with his Kavalos. Good on you. I don't think it's really indicative of anything else. Aside from that, though, Daintalos the Exile has seen massive play. Normally, Daintalos comes with his electric zombies. The electric zombies are very good. They bring some very interesting indirect damage to death lists with their Crackling Arcs ability. And Daintalos himself, his gun is very good. It's strength 6. It's got a good damage profile. He's one of the few wizards in the game that you don't have to put extra points for Divine Blessings into to buff that up to strength 5 or 6. So yeah, I really like Daintalos. I love playing him, and I'm happy to see that he's in there. In 18% of lists, up 10 from last quarter. That might be something for Games Workshop to look at. But I think that overall he isn't so impactful that he's just outright winning games by himself. I think it's more of a case of he's something interesting that people like to bring. Knight of Shrouds, it got points decreases in the April update. It is now this pretty neat kind of little tanky fighter, really. It's got Resurrect because it's Nighthorn. Interesting that the Knight of Shrouds managed to kick the Wielder of the Blade off of this spot. I think the Order of the Blade was looking at something like 8% last quarter. Now the Knight of Shrouds is here with 11% of the field. So yeah, good on you, Nighthorn. As we've seen, I pretty much think that all death lists will be bringing some kind of a Nighthorn hero as an ally, simply because they do have that Omni Resurrect that can resurrect anything in the game, including your heroes, including monsters, whatever. I think they'll always be there, but it's nice to see that the flavor of fighter is changing to different things. Going from some slightly more diverse to very focused when we go to destruction, Brute Boss with Chopper, 28%, almost 30% of all lists see a Brute Boss with Chopper as an ally. That doesn't even include the Ironjawz players themselves, who again are very popular. Again, with the Clawback, 20% of all destruction lists are allying in a Clawback, and 11% are bringing in a Beast Knob. I'm not so concerned about bringing the Beast Knob as an ally. It is a very good piece. It brings a little bit of utility in there. It's got that very interesting control ability that forces your opponent to attack it. But what's concerning me is that Brute Boss and that Clawback. If everyone is bringing those two, and they pretty much are, between them, they make up almost 50% of all allies in destruction. That's probably something that Games Workshop are going to want to look at. The Boss of Boss Chopper, like, you're always going to bring a Brute because it has that amazing Umessin ability. So what are they going to do? Are they going to increase the cost of the Brute Boss? In which case there is that Warhammer Underworlds unit that you can bring a couple of Brutes for a little bit cheaper. Is that something that's going to be more popular? Or are they going to do something to you messing, in which case it will hit Ironjawz themselves? I don't know, but these are the kind of things that Games Workshop will want to look at if they are doing match play balance passes. Similarly with the clawback kind of fills that role that Slake Slash fills for Slaanesh Cyberites, where it's that very fast damaging piece that's not necessarily all that tanky. I mean, it does have a lot of wounds, but its toughness isn't fantastic, so eventually it'll die, but it's kind of this fast missile piece. I haven't seen enough of what the clawback is doing recently to be able to make a judgment on this. It's very good, that I can say, but one thing that I do want to stress is that any hits to the clawback will mean that the Gorge and Warpack, who are already struggling, will have further issues. So maybe it's a case of increasing the cost of the clawback, decreasing the cost of some of the Gorges in Moorpack, still allowing them to bring 5, maybe 6 guys. Maybe that's something Games Workshop will do. I don't know. I don't have my crystal ball with me today. Going into Chaos, of course, Vexmore in a quarter of all Chaos lists. Varangard, popular as ever. Lassavir, why'd you bring Lassavir? Because if you're playing Vexmore, Lassavir dies, Vexmore gets free abilities. This is expected. I expected Vexmore to be here. The Varangard in only 10% of lists. Now that's very interesting. Chaos do have a lot of very impactful allies. A lot of people have been bringing Ephelim. A lot of people still like to bring the Trueblood. There's a lot of things in there. I think that's why we're seeing a decrease in Varangard. But if we look at the top lists, we still do see that combo of Vexmore and Varangard, just as this 1-2 punch, one very fast assassin, one slower, I'm going to put this thing on a point, you cannot brawl with me piece. Vexmore, I still think, and I have said for the longest time, he's kind of fine at his points level, though I think that he does need a bump because he is essentially very easy, very cheap damage. I would like to see him get to 200 points all in, including the Blessing. I think that would be absolutely fine. That puts him kind of on par with those Annihilator Primes that people like to take, and those points increases that they saw back in April. That's what I would do with him. I think he's okay, but I don't like the piece. I don't like the kind of playstyle that he fosters. All right, and that's it from me for today. Thank you very much for watching. That's been the numbers. I think is an interesting indication of how the meta developed and what warbands are doing and how people are playing. How did your warband do? That's something that I would like to hear. Are you having any successes? I'd like to hear that down in the comments. We'll have a good talk about it. As always, if you like what you see, please don't forget to like and subscribe. That's the end of the video. So as always, I've been Itan. This has been Off Meta Musings, and we'll see you next time.